Is you guys are always thinking about implications of these kinds of findings. So I would love for you guys to brainstorm with me, especially at the end of the talk, and tell me what kind of interpretations you could make of some of the data and findings I'm going to show you guys. But yeah, so I think you guys are going to be in for a bit of a strange experience because you're getting a very hardcore grammar lesson for about 10 minutes, I think, in the middle of this talk. But you know, it's a necessary evil. I should use this little guy. So basically, I'm just going to introduce to you guys my PhD research topic, which is looking at language change in an online support group for bipolar disorder. And then I'm going to introduce to you what we call a theory of language called systemic functional linguistics. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that. Ever? No. Okay. It's a notoriously complicated branch of linguistics that's sort of very different from the work you might have seen from like Chomsky and linguists like this. It's trying to figure out how lexis, how words and grammar comes together to make meanings and social functions. So it's quite complicated, but it's a very useful approach. And I'm basically today trying to show you guys the viability of using a systemic functional approach for doing research of computer-mediated communication or online support group communication or something like that. So I'll show you guys the kind of things I think SFL as a theory can solve, and I'm hoping maybe you guys would be able to apply it to some of the cases you work with. But then, yeah, I also want to show you what the limits, exactly where I'm at in my project, and ask for a bit of help. I think that would be great. And also feel free to interrupt if there's something you don't understand, because this is a very interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary kind of event. So I'll just contextualize my thesis research. I'm sure you're all familiar with online forums, especially this way. I think this kind of thing, fairly familiar. You know, you click links to a new post. It's called a thread, and then it's got posts from maybe new users, maybe veteran users. This is a very old style architecture, and I'm a little disappointed that my thesis is working with the kind of almost Web 1.0 kind of tool, but I think a lot of the stuff we're doing can kind of transcend the sort of side architecture. But yeah, so that's the forum. It has about 60,000 posts. It's on a site that has sub-forums for, I don't know, 100 other health concerns. It's one of the it's more popular than most of the others. There are almost 6,000 users at the time of data collection, which was last year. And very typical of online support groups or online forums in general, you have a very, very high dropout rate. So almost everybody who signs up only ever posts something once or twice. And then you have usually these few people, which I'm calling veteran members. Some people might call experts, or we'll just say veteran for now. They've logged over 1,000 posts, and they really influence the direction of the community. And yeah, so essentially the site has some rules. On this particular community, in line with a lot of online support groups, people can't ask for a diagnosis because other members aren't seen as being trained to provide one. So people say things like, do you guys think I'm bipolar? And often they get a response, we can't tell you whether you are or not because we're not doctors. And that was one of the things that originally sort of interested me in this community, is how they are very quick to affirm that they're not health professionals, but then at the same time they still provide health advice and social support. So yeah, broadly we could call this like a normative biomedical ideology that goes on within this community. So they typically don't like Eastern medicine, alternative medicine, holistic approaches. They typically say medication regimens, meetings with the actual correct health professionals, that's the way you get better. There are communities that focus on alternative treatments, but this one, it's very obvious from just browsing for a couple of minutes that veteran members very much subscribe to fairly conservative Western medical norms. And yeah, you also notice, this is like one of the findings I'm going to talk about, but it's very quick. You just need to read the page for a couple of minutes, and you see that you've got veterans answering the questions of newcomers, and you've got veterans doing things like welcoming and speaking as we rather than I. That stuff's obvious without any sort of quantification. So yeah, here's just a sort of screen cap of the forum. You can see 450 pages of posts. So quite a lot. I'm not sure, I think you guys have varying proficiencies with computational stuff. I'm just going to skate over the actual process of making the data set. But essentially what we did, we used wget to spider all of these websites, and so we've got 10,000 HTML pages on our computer. Then from there we use a Python library called Beautiful Soup that extracts the actual posts, the people's writing, and puts that into individual files. We did some spelling normalization, which was important so that we could have more accurate counting of linguistic features. That was also done with Python. Then we went and we used Stanford Core NLP, which is a suite of tools for annotating language with grammatical categories and syntax and stuff. And we ran basically the whole suite over that. I should point out, by the way, I've got this slideshow. If anyone's taking pictures and they actually wanted to grab the whole slideshow, it's available via this first GitHub link. There's a folder called Talks and the PDFs in there. So feel free to do that rather than, if that's easier than taking pictures. Yeah, exactly. Sorry. Well, you can type it out, but that's quite burdensome these days. Yeah. So then basically after we had, many annotated text files, it's a few gigabytes worth of text. When it's all annotated, we create subcorpora. So we split our corpus of data into 10 groups. And these 10 groups reflect the various stages of membership. So what I did is I took everybody's first post, that went into one subcorpus, and then everybody's second and third post went into a second one, and so on, until we had 10 corpora of roughly equal size. And then by looking at each of those in turn, we can start looking at longitudinal change, how the language of new members is different to the language of veteran members. So the problem I faced, and still face, is there aren't a lot of linguistic methodologies and tools for doing this kind of stuff. After you've got your annotated data, it's difficult to find out what to do with it. So I've written a kind of little Python module called CorpKit, which I'll show you guys very quickly today because it's sort of entwined with how I got my findings. It's an open source tool for manipulating large textual data sets.
When you do the parse from the posts to the Stanford Core NLP,
yeah,
you do it for understand like semantically what is being discussed?
It goes on at many different levels. So the first thing they would do is break things into words, a process called tokenization.
Yeah.
It's sort of difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then so you build up, once you've got a definition of, you probably start by identifying sentences, then by identifying words, and then you figure out the different parts of speech, noun and verb, adjective, stuff like that. And then you start identifying that's a noun phrase, that's a clause.
So you use like also POS tag?
Yeah, part of speech tags, that's the noun and stuff, and the noun, the verb, the adjective, the determiner. And those, different sort of patterns of those, we use those to automatically figure out the underlying grammatical structure of the sentence. So basically the reason you do that is it makes it possible to do very sophisticated kinds of searching of the data. You don't just have to search for the words themselves, but you can search for any noun that's modified by the adjective big, something like that. So it's much more sophisticated than you would get from just sort of searching through text files. So as I said, anybody's welcome to jump and use this kit whenever they want. You can install it via pip. And the other thing I've done is created this awesome thing I just discovered called the IPython Notebook. I don't know if anybody's ever used one of these before, but it's basically a web interface where you can run Python code in real time and display images inline. I'll show you guys in a minute because it's a really awesome methodological innovation. But the main sort of problem I faced, I found this bit was actually not so difficult. It's very systematic, the tools work, once you get them installed, it happens. But then you're left with a collection of 8 million words. And they're sitting in files and folders, that's all great. You've got tools for analyzing them, but you have so much language, you can't even read through it by yourself. You're never going to be able to. I could never read through my whole data set, so you have to figure out ways to usefully reduce this information or pull out things that are going to be interesting. So my big task really, and it was a lot of brainstorming, was how are we going to systematically investigate this data set to make meanings, to figure out how people communicate within this community and how that changes over time. So to take sort of a provocation text, we've got here a user named Catlin. She says this is one of her first posts to the community back in 2008. So she's currently logged over 5,000 posts, but this was her third at the time. And it says, can someone help me with the lingo you'll use? PDoc, does this mean psychiatrist or primary doc? And she gets a response from a veteran that says, PDoc means psychiatrist, smiley face, right? So this to me is very standard language of a newcomer to the community. So now take one of Catlin's more recent posts, one of the last ones that she's posted actually. So you say, hi, sorry you're having such a tough time. It's not completely unheard of for PDocs, psychiatrists, to come up with different DXs, that's diagnoses, for the same patient. When you start looking at the diagnoses, you notice that they're not all that different. Your PDoc DX'd you with bipolar disorder and major depressive disorder. So you can see here you've got a total change in the way language is being used, right? And you have some kind of interesting history. If you remember that one of her first questions was, how does this term get used? And then not only does she give the term, but then she glosses it with its definition next to it. So this to me was really promising, because it's like, wow, you can really dig back through this data and see that this person, perhaps because of her struggle to learn the term, remembered to always explain to people what it meant in the future. So I thought this was really cool. But then the main thing is just, this is a radically different kind of language. When you read it, it sounds totally different to how she sounded when she started out. And that's basically the essence of that, is what I was trying to map. So, yeah, I sort of had a few questions here. Like, has her language changed over time? And I think, yes, you can see evidence that it sounds much different to how it sounded in the beginning. But first of all, what exactly is changing? Aside from saying that's a longer post and that's a shorter one, what is it that's actually changing in this language use, aside from kind of sounding totally different and using different terms? Then the other thing is, does this change happen to everybody that enters the community? Is it predictable? Could we predict it? And then the main question, which is what I want help with, is what causes these changes? Is it the site architecture? Is it the other members? Is it this person developing and applying their own knowledge of their health condition? And how do we distinguish between those? So basically, if we want to answer these kinds of questions, I think it really helps to get a theory of language. And there are dozens and dozens of theories of language, and I'm just going to introduce one. It's called Systemic Functional Linguistics by a former professor at Sydney University named Michael Halliday. He has written probably the most elaborate grammar of English anybody ever has. He puts it together as Systemic Functional Linguistics. The reason it's got this name, Systemic Functional Linguistics, is because he's trying to draw attention to these two things, the systemicness and the functionalness. Systemic is saying that under this view of language, language is a sign system. So if anybody's familiar with semiotics and signs and signifiers, Halliday likes to look at language as an interrelated set of signs. And what users do is they select from that system different kinds of meanings to make. They select realizations, and then they put them forward in the world. So you're kind of selecting from the system of grammar and lexis and stuff like that. Functional is that the reason you would make these selections is to do meaningful things in the world. So you're not just speaking randomly. Everything you do and the way language is structured is so that we can actually get social tasks accomplished in the real world, right? It's not just a set of sentences and grammatical rules. These are innately tied to actually getting stuff done. Which seems pretty obvious, but that's a fairly new linguistic development that, we think of things like that. But the other, and this is where I think we have promise for human-computer interaction in areas like that, the other main thing about SFL is this idea: context is in text. So often people talk about text versus context and how it's hard to figure out what something means when you don't have its context. But SFL tends to argue that the opposite is true. If you do an analysis of the grammar, you should be able to come up with what the context actually was, because the context is actually embedded within the text, and texts actually build their context at the same time, right? So the reason I went with this framework for my analysis is that meant I could abstract one sentence from one post of an online forum and figure out what the context was from just looking at the grammar of the sentence, right? So that's a pretty cool idea, and I'll show you how it plays out. This is kind of a roadmap for how SFL works, and it's really, really dense. I've had to teach this before, and it takes a very long time. You guys will get a brief overview. It's fascinating, but the introduction is about a 700-page book. It's rough. But the idea, basically, is we have down here, this is realized language as the different systems. If anybody's ever learned a foreign language, you have mood, you have transitivity, right? So you have mood, this is like the use of imperatives versus subjunctives versus declaratives, statements, questions, demands, that kind of thing. You have the transitivity system, which is about verbs and their arguments. And then you have the system of theme, which controls things like and, or, but, if, and the way that information is ordered. So the argument in SFL is that these things down here actually in realized instantiated language, so in words and grammar, through abstraction, end up creating things, creating what we might call a genre. So the idea is that the mood system, so this is declaratives, interrogatives, questions, statements, what these things are responsible for is realizing interpersonal meanings. So that system of grammar is responsible for negotiating the relationships between people and world. So that's totally different to the system of transitivity, verbs and their arguments, which is designed to make experiential meanings, which is trying to communicate what happened to whom under what circumstances, right? So what this grammar does is it actually says whenever people are communicating, I think I'll skip that one. Whenever people are communicating, they're attending to 3 different kinds of meaning at the same time, right? And any clause has all 3 of these meanings embedded within it. So you have these interpersonal meanings, the relationships between people. You have ideation, this should be experiential meanings, I should say, which is what happens to whom under what circumstances. And you have textual meanings, and this is the role that language is playing in the interaction, right? So when you look at sports commentary, what's the role of the commentator? He's kind of recounting the events. That's a profoundly different thing to maybe a recipe, where the recipe is explaining how you would go about making the food. So this is the sort of purpose of text and the role of language. It's complicated, but it's a really important dimension when we're doing an analysis of text. So, I've actually covered this.
Sorry,
Yes?
just to be clear, thanks for explaining this to us because we don't understand.
Yeah, sorry, I know it's pretty dense.
But what you're saying, if context is in the text,
Mm-hmm.
and I gave you a recipe, and I also transcribed a sports commentary,
Yeah,
you would be able to distill the context from those texts.
totally. I mean, if you think of the text of a recipe, you say, this lovely cake is beautiful in the summer. That would be the first sentence, followed by a list of ingredients, followed by a series of steps in an imperative voice, which would be, mix this in a bowl, and then take this over here and put it in the oven. And I'll show you an example, actually.
You're saying that a machine can discern.
Oh.
A machine can discern the difference.
Not really. It would be tricky, and it would involve really complicated analysis of the grammar and the lexis. That's basically the point we're at in computational linguistics, would be trying to figure that kind of stuff out. You could do it probabilistically, right? So if sentences are very long, you could say it's probably not a casual conversation. If we recorded this, I've got big, long clauses, and you guys have very few, a little bit shorter. That's indicative of a lecturing situation, right? So if you had a database of here's what recipes usually have, lots of imperatives, lists of ingredients, blah, 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 then you could potentially pass this and say, okay, there are many imperatives in it, therefore it's likely to either be somebody issuing a command on a sports field or somebody issuing a recipe, and it's a written text, so let's call it a recipe. So that's kind of probabilistic grammar is starting to happen, but it's still a ways off, and beyond the scope of this project for the most part. So I want to show you guys a little bit about the interpersonal system. So this is about how language is used as a resource for making interpersonal meanings between people. This is an interesting one for me. It's probably the easiest to explain. If we look at me versus you right now, in a lecturing context, you find like there are things I can say that maybe it's difficult for you guys to say comfortably or acceptably, right? So if I'm asking for an answer to a question, if I've said 2 + 2, would you tell me the answer? That's okay for a lecturer to say something like that to students, a guy giving a seminar. I could even say something like, I think you should tell me the answer. And maybe you could, it sounds a little aggressive, but it's a possible thing to say. Or I could even sort of say, no, also not tell me the readings, I should say, tell me the answer. So I could actually give an imperative, a command saying, tell me this, do that, right? Whereas you guys have kind of a limited set of options. Because of this power dynamic we're in, interpersonally, you could say something like, can you please speak slower? You speak very fast. Sorry about that, by the way. Or you could say something really kind of incongruent. You could use this declarative. You could say, we are having trouble understanding you, which is a way to issue a statement that's actually trying to tell me to slow down. But then there's this final one. Is it possible for you guys to construct an imperative? Can you actually say to me appropriately, slow down? It seems kind of weird, so you'd find other ways to do it because we have a difference. There's a sort of a different power relationship here, and that affects the kind of linguistic choices we can make. So, the added problem we have, and again, this might be something you guys can tell me a little more about, is multimodality. The idea that we don't just have grammar communicating meanings, we also have things like gestures, right? And the fact that we're sitting, standing, wearing certain clothes, all of these things also generate meanings, right? We know that inherently, but then how do you account for those? Like, you can take a clause and break it down into subjects and objects and verbs, but it's very hard to take someone's clothing and systematically account for what that actually accomplishes, what meanings that makes. So when you're dealing with online communication, you have sort of inherently multimodal communication. Even stuff that was posted within this forum, if we went right back, you have site features here that make a meaningful difference on the interaction. You get this number of posts right here, and this little, this is quite an arbitrary, but this connotes expertise. I think this goes up over the course of your membership. That is a meaningful thing, right? Your choice of username, the fact that your gender is marked, right? There's a reason these certain features are on display. But they're multimodal features, and it makes it a little more complicated for us, because you can annotate language with its nouns and verbs, but you can't annotate clothing with formal and informal, for example. But it is still possible, I think, to use this systemic functional grammar, dividing things into three kinds of meaning, to look at images. It would be more difficult to look at videos, but images are a good sort of case study of probably where SFL as a theory of language can help us. So I grabbed this interesting image off the web. It's an ad for IKEA that was in a newspaper. And rather than telling us about furniture that we could buy, it's communicating how to make and eat a shawarma, like a doner kebab, that kind of thing. And it's actually advertising the fact that they now sell shawarma at certain IKEAs, right? So my argument here is that we could do the same analysis of interpersonal meaning, experiential meaning, and textual meaning. We can actually map that onto this image here, right? So you still have, essentially, when you look at interpersonal relationships here, you have instructions being given, right? You're familiar with how IKEA works. This is what's being, you have an instructor who's telling us what to do, yeah? And then you have arrows, these kinds of things like this. These are also telling you what to do. So this stuff is, it's embedded in there. Here again, an arrow is saying the food goes in the mouth, right? So you have that kind of stuff, but you also have this experiential meaning, so what's being spoken about. We have IKEA, we have a person, we've got food, we've got the kebab, we've got the ingredients. And when you say all those words together, tomato, chips, pickles, meat, we already know we're talking about food, right? And so that works pretty easily. Then we also have this textual dimension where we're speaking about a sequence of things, right? So this text has a structure. There's a way it's supposed to be read up here and across here. So this is a recipe. It conforms very broadly to the ingredients list and list of steps, right? So even though this totally lacks words, aside from this and this, it still has a grammar, but it's a visual grammar. And that's really tricky. And I'm hoping that you guys could explain how we would make some meaning using multimodal rather than just linguistic cues. So now the last thing I want to get across is this idea of genre, which appeared back here. So in systemic functional linguistics, the idea is that when we're doing anything in the world, we're participating in different genres, right? So if you're buying and selling, there's kind of a genre of buying and selling. Or if you're communicating on a forum, perhaps there's a genre of forum communication that you're kind of instantiating. So basically, what we like to think of genres as is as staged goal-oriented processes, right? So genres have stages and steps. You look at the recipe, it has a title, it has a list of ingredients, and then it has instructions. And then it's also goal-oriented, so there's always a purpose behind a genre. In buying and selling, you're trying to sell or buy something. In recipes, you're trying to communicate how to make this food. So what we can look at genre as, we can say that it's all three of these meta-functions at a very abstract level combining. So any culturally recognizable set of role relationships, things being spoken about, and modes of communication, right? So in this case, we kind of have a genre, and this is a humorous text, right? Often humor derives from people playing with genre norms, yeah? So you see this corresponds very much to an IKEA assembly manual, how you would put together IKEA furniture. So it doesn't alter that dimension at all. It keeps the role relationships between you, the person being addressed, and the addresser. That all stays the same. The only thing that changes is the experiential dimension, what's being spoken about. And the humor comes from switching something like furniture to something like kebabs and meat. So that's the only little change that was made, and so now we have humorous text. Or you could generate a humorous text by making this about furniture, but messing with the sequence of events so it was very, very difficult to understand what was going on. That would also be humorous. It would be modifying a different dimension. So with this kind of really, really quick treatment of grammar, I hope some of it was comprehensible. It's tough, but it goes. So I'll take you over to this IPython notebook. So this is where, this is kind of an interface for manipulating the corpus of 8 million words about bipolar disorder. So what you can do is very quickly view, here's a fairly benign example. So we can chart, down here on the x-axis we have everybody's first post to the community, everybody's second and third, those 10 groups I told you about. And so we can look for how frequent words are. So if you make a list of words that are medications, and you have Seroquel, which is a common drug used in the treatment of bipolar disorder, you can see it has a fairly standard trajectory. It's roughly 12% of the medication words consistently across membership. So that word by itself doesn't really change a whole lot. But what we're interested in here is combinations of words and grammar at the same time, what we'll call lexicogramma. And so some of the findings, and this is why I encourage anybody to, they can go to GitHub, they can download this resource and they can start manipulating it themselves. Some of the findings we have, so we have things like the use of declaratives, so actually giving statements, drops quite radically in the later stages of membership. So this is just a grammatical feature, it's not lexical at all. And this is a fairly expected finding. So here we have those mood types, questions, statements. The imperative here in green rises quite steadily in frequency. So the reason for that is people in their later stages of membership, they're comfortable saying things like see a doctor, get help, that sort of stuff. Whereas new members can't come in and say, give me advice. They say, would you please give me advice, or something like that. So we can visualize that change in role relationships just through an analysis of mood types overall. We can also look at modality. This is also a part of the mood system, where you've got all these different, so these words can, could, would, they play a really important role in communicating how certain you are about events, how probable events are. These stay largely static, but when you break them down into this sort of core groups like this, in this guy here, the combination of will and would and won't and all for I will, this one we see a kind of rise in frequency over time. And I was quite interested in, what's going on there? So you need to go into the data a little bit more. And sorry, these are tiny, but this is called concordancing, quite a common task in corpus linguistics, where you look for your term of interest in context. And so the interesting thing that kind of starts emerging here is you've got veteran members using this construction as a way of dispensing advice. They don't say, see a doctor, they say, if I were you, I would see a doctor. And that struck me as quite interesting from my sort of background in healthcare communication, because it's profoundly different from the way a doctor talks. A doctor doesn't say, if I were you, I would smoke less. A doctor can use these imperative forms because they have this power, social power over you. Whereas, in this community, if you dig through these results, you find, maybe these are the better examples. If you were hearing voices, I would call the PDoc immediately. So these are kind of common ways that veterans provide advice. And I think the kind of meaning I'm generating from this, and this is just what I'm sort of stopping the limits of what I can understand at the moment, it's a way of being, still dispensing advice, but not infringing on the position of the health professional. It would be wrong to actually dispense advice in the imperative form. So what they do is they flag their subjectivity and they say, look, I am a lot like you, we suffer from the same condition, but I'm a veteran of the community. And as a veteran, here is what I would do. So you could take after me, and I'm a bit of a role model for you. So that is, all I have time to tell you guys about the mood dimension of language in this community. But we also have the experiential dimension. So we have which words and things are being spoken about over time, the most and least. So here we've got dramatic increase in the use of the term we, which again is fairly obvious because people start talking on behalf of the forum and saying we would do this. Over here, most of the mentions of we are people saying like my family and I, we're worried about my son's health, that kind of thing. But who the we actually denotes changes when you count them up, and you start seeing that we is referring to the board itself or to bipolar people, and you have them saying, oh, we suffer a great burden as being bipolar. But that's a characteristic of veteran language and not new people's language. You have also some things relating to vague language, something that emerges really strongly. You can get, it's hard to find some of these, you get discussion of anyone going down when you have these requests, can anybody help me? When people don't know who specifically can help, they say something broad like anybody. And we see that dropping in frequency because people become a little more assertive and certain. On the other hand, we've got jargon terms. So what we saw in Caitlin's initial post where she said, what does PDOC mean? You can see all of these terms dramatically rising in frequency at the late stages of membership. So people start talking about their meds or their PDOC, or they start calling bipolar their BP. Yeah, so I want to focus a little on this jargon example because this is I think where you guys could help me a little bit. So basically every single jargon term that I could find goes up in frequency over the course of membership. But the question is, why does that happen? And I would love if you guys could tell me. Why would jargon terms go up at later stages of membership? If anybody.
They're more immersed in the culture.
Okay.
And they have more knowledge. And they're aligning with the language that is used by the other members of the community who are experts, and they're beginning to see themselves more as experts.
Okay, yeah.
For those reasons.
Yes, and you can see it's complicated, right? It's an interrelated set of ideas. But yeah, the other issue that's very hard to deal with is something like lurking. All we're doing here is measuring people by their post count. But many of the people who show up say, look, I've been reading these for months. I already know what all the jargon terms mean. So even though many people are aware, you still have less use of the jargon terms. And yeah, so this is complicated. I wonder why. And so I wanted to sort of... Basically, in applied linguistic theory, the problem is that you could chalk those changes up to two contradictory hypotheses. So we've got this idea of socialization, which I think people have worked with, which has sort of Vygotskian origins, this sort of idea. Broadly, I'm paraphrasing, socialization is the idea that new members learn from veterans and implement the linguistic repertoire. So they learn a word like PDOC, and then they use it. So that's one hypothesis, but then there's another way we could look at it of a genre awareness, where people actually enter the community aware that they're going to be the newcomer and that there are people in a position of power above them, and therefore they adopt knowingly a set of practices that mark them as new because they're aware of the proper role relationships within the community. But these two hypotheses totally contradict each other. You can't really have both at the same time. And then my added question here is, how are we going to account for the role of the technology, of the hardware and the software on which these communications were produced? To look at this jargonization phenomenon, I think we can apply our metafunctional paradigm from SFL. So if we just wanted to, basically, I think you had the right solution for why does jargonization occur. But I think what we can do is we can sort of separate it into these three systems. So we can say jargonization demonstrates expertise and belonging, right? So that's an interpersonal relationship. It shows that you are a powerful member of the community, that you know what you're talking about, and so on, right? But there's also a very important experiential dimension for jargon. So what jargon actually does, and the reason jargon might exist, it makes it possible to distinguish between very technical things. If you go to a mechanics garage and you're not very familiar with mechanics, you'll find them using a lot of terms that they're using to distinguish between very nuanced sets of tools that you might all call, you know, some kind of hammer. And so jargon does exist for that. And, you know, people are often very critical of jargon because of this element. They find it obscures things from new members. But the reason it also exists, yeah, is so that we can communicate very technical things. And we at the university, we all use jargon terms all the time. And I mightn't understand the ones in your department, for example. It's not because you're trying to exclude me. It's just because you're very familiar with this set of terms for explaining things. And then the final thing, and this is where I'm just sort of getting to, and where I stop, unfortunately, is jargon terms almost always are shorter. That's a feature of jargon everywhere, but also imperatives, when you say, let me in, that's shorter than would you let me in, right? So many of the changes that go on in this community are shorter to write or type. And this is where, I was kind of plunged into doubt, and I was like, oh, hang on, maybe a lot of the changes in this community are actually just here as people innovating so that they don't have to do so much work in order to communicate. You find people develop signatures in the forum, and those signatures list their medications, and they say, here is my current medication regimen. The reason they do that, yeah, sure, in part it has an interpersonal purpose, or they're trying to communicate information about themselves, but they're also trying to save some time, so they don't need to keep repeating things, right? And that, to me, is where this sort of textual dimension of what kind of site architecture do we have, we can see that it does play a role. But what I can't do, and what I'd really like to be able to do, is distinguish between these quite concretely and quantify the difference between them. So, the last thing I will finish with here, basically want to say, the main issue I'm facing in my study is that my methods inherently involve taking text away from its context, right? The benefit of SFL is that you can kind of reconstitute that context if you try, but at the end of the day, I'm left finding these kind of statistical phenomena, then looking how they played out in context. It doesn't, to me, seem to be an optimal way to do a multimodal study. What I'd also like to be able to do is do some predictive stuff. Can we make some more predictions based on what we know about the meta functions? And then can we measure things? This stuff is really all at my current limits. And then, yeah, we have this issue of how do things play out on new technology. These forums are quite traditional. When there's a thread, people discuss the title and contents of the first post, whereas then you go to an environment like Reddit or certain social media things, and the replies very quickly go off topic. And every little thread on there starts its own unique conversation. How would you do the same methodology that I've applied here to just a site that is still a text-based forum architecture? It just has a slightly different structure, and that radically changes how you would go about understanding what's going on. And yeah, ultimately what I'd like to see people working on, and we do have some people in linguistics at the moment who are really trying to apply these methods of systemic functional linguistics to very new kinds of emerging communication, like Skype calls and stuff like that. And that's what I'm hoping to make some suggestions for that in my research. But it's all sort of a whole new world. So on that note, yeah, interpret the data, or questions about how SFL works or anything, I'm happy to field. I just wanted to be able to have a bit of a conversation about it. And
yeah, just thinking about one of your sort of later points about trying to ascertain why it is people adopt certain practices. So adding details to their signature or changing it. Have you done much in the way of trying to identify case studies of individual users who have adopted certain practices and following them throughout their life? So to see if there were cases instances that led them down that path?
It's going to be one of my main suggestions for future research is follow some of the individual. It's very possible. It's super easy with the with the methods to basically track everything. And yeah, and it's when you dig back, that's where you find real instances rather than just sort of general changes, and you find where they actually struggled with a jargon term or where they were exposed to a new idea. You can really see that. So yeah, I would love to see that analysis take place. Now, yeah.
What wouldn't be practical, what would be amazing is if you could take some of the people from this forum and see them entering a completely different forum.
Yeah, exactly.
Their expert language suddenly falls away and
yeah.
can do that.
Yeah, exactly. You can see sort of all the different avenues you could go down with this, just modifying one variable. But yeah, PhD thesis is only so long as you find out when you get halfway through them.
I really enjoyed this. And just some thoughts on how this might connect to some of the work that's been done on each side. One is the reader-to-leader framework, which is a popular reader-to-leader framework that describes the trajectories that people follow from being a lurker to being what you call veterans.
Okay.
But it's a very popular, very simple descriptive framework.
Yeah. Is it focused? Does it go down to grammar?
No.
No.
No, it just talks about online communities.
Yeah.
It's commonly used as a vocabulary, I guess, to describe different roles within an online community.
Yeah, that would be. I did a lot of my early PhD readings with these. There are adders and synthesizers and different roles within communities and that kind of stuff. I didn't really like, a lot of the studies did this sort of dividing people into 6 or 7 types, and they said, look, this guy is a synthesizer of content, and I was never really comfortable with those. But yeah, I haven't heard this reader to leader, so maybe it's
It's more similar.
yeah. Okay, but even so, no, it'd be very handy for the lit review because it's tough to find stuff on emerging technology and.
And the other ideas are the communities of practice ideas and that you can peripheral participation, so people learn the ropes as they go for the idea
Yeah.
of apprenticeship.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that falls into line, with socialization quite well. And there's a very influential papers on kids in a schoolroom and stuff that communities of practice. There have been a couple of communities of practice studies of online support groups. So C of P or whatever you call it, it divides things into shared repertoire, mutual endeavor, and engagement as the 3 major dimensions of how you could classify a community. But yeah, I want to get away from questions of whether or not things are communities and stuff, and just look at this. So my thesis doesn't have too much to do with what the point of these meanings is. I'm just sort of saying they can be identified, and we've got to move on from there. But yeah, it was very influential in applied linguistics, though it came from totally outside of linguistics. So yeah, it's an interesting research area. Yep.
We have a language technologies group in the department.
Okay.
They'd be very interested in this talk, so you should follow that because you might get satisfaction in other ways. I hope this is valuable too, because you get different sorts of responses.
Yeah.
They're much more computational.
Yeah,
and they'll give you some ideas.
I've spoken a bit like Stephen Bird and these kind of guys
Yep.
down there. Yeah, he developed the NLTK, which I rely on in my little toolkit. It does all the things like tokenization, stemming, and lemmatization.
And Tim Miller.
Yeah. Tim Baldwin.
A different sort of question, and away from the computational question, but if the computational problem was solved entirely, and you could do exactly what you want to do computationally, how would that change the forum or that case particularly those people
Okay.
suffering bipolar?
Yeah, the first part of the question in terms of if you had perfect systems for doing this kind of stuff, first of all, that would radically change the way we live currently, because that would allow generation of text that's appropriate, so you could automatically generate newscasts based on feeding in, so that stuff is a very, very sort of sci-fi long way away.
I want to, not the implications for something else.
But for this, if we had perfectly accurate tools and methods and things, yeah, part of the issue here is that these parsers, when they're dealing with poor quality, with non-standard language, when you have people typing "I'm" without an apostrophe, unless you manually corrected those, that will be interpreted as one word, and then you won't be able to figure out the subject and the verb, and the whole parse of the sentence collapses. But the good thing about dealing with very large data sets is you have so many examples that even if you just disregard the 10% that are, just poorly annotated, you still get useful examples. So to be honest, even if you had perfect parsing, I'm not sure it would dramatically affect, aside from maybe highlighting some changes. It would allow kind of more nuanced distinctions than are possible using current parsers. But in terms of what we could then do with the knowledge, I'm not sure. In healthcare communication, people would be interested in developing frameworks for identifying successful or unsuccessful interactions between health professionals and patients. A lot of the work in our group in the medical school is looking at health encounters, in an emergency room in Hong Kong, something like that. So a different, face-to-face context, but again, using grammar to identify problems in that interaction and how those problems could be barriers to treatment outcomes.
So I thought you might have had some unspoken concept or theory about the change of language in forums or for remediation or something like that. So notions of either helping people as they progress through a forum as the years pass, or actually trying to see whether there's some linguistic indicator of change over time.
Yeah, I mean, I could see the potential applications, but it was just one of these unfortunate things that that's exactly how I got into my project, wanting to be able to discuss that kind of stuff, and then there was such a burden on creating a kit for getting through this that my focus for this thesis has ended up being profoundly methodological. But I'm hoping when I get through it, that really addressing those. But yeah, that would be a whole new task.
Question. Because you told us that you want also to improve this and come into more social forums, can you think about the use of emojis and how they work here? Because sometimes I have found in new forums that people use emojis to show emotions and that you identify as new users, while old users don't use. They go straight to the point because they are not wasting your time. Have you analyzed something about that?
Yeah, I was very influenced by a paper written, I'm searching for his name in my head, Philip. It escapes me, but looking at paralinguistics accomplished through, Schandorf his name was, and he wrote a great paper last year about how people use emoticons to place their body to sort of embody themselves online. And it's meant radical revision of some of the earlier studies of emoticons, the stuff by Susan Herring and people like that, where they've said I've read some really horrible ones that just say, Asians have Asian versions of smileys and, they're marking Asianness and stuff. And that, first of all, it's difficult to automatically pull them out, so it's escaped my grasp with my methods. But yeah, at the same time, what I would ideally want to do is, look at that through the 3 meta functions and say, for an emoticon, is it saying, don't worry, this is casual, it communicates interesting information about tone, but, it does a lot of complicated things. So people have done very minute studies of, all the different meanings made by a single emoticon. And we're all very aware of them. Anybody who types on Facebook chat or something and uses these emoticons, we're fluent in decoding what they mean. And they can be very complicated kinds of meanings. We're so attuned to this from being fluent in it that you can be, someone's mad at you when they use a full stop or something. And that kind of stuff, that's totally above the abilities of current language parsers and stuff. But of course it's central to the way they make meaning.
There's nothing more infuriating than when you go to make a particular emoticon and then Facebook or something turns it into a face that doesn't look like the expression.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so fascinating. I would love to be able to devote a lot of time to this disparity between how fluent we are in speaking like this online and then how little we're able to actually describe it in an academic context. I had one of my one of the main people in our linguistics department sat down at one of the confirmation meetings, and in the 10 minutes before it started, he said, did you guys see this study where someone said that you can use the full stop to show that you're angry at somebody online? And he was so excited by this, and we were all, every PhD student there was like, we do that all the time. We didn't need a study to tell us, we decode that semiotic symbol every single day. And it was that disparity, how long it takes for academic knowledge to generate on a subject that we all kind of already get, it's quite bizarre.
Just another thought as well, thinking about the kind of the longitudinal tracking you did. Did you look at all who actually stays and whether the language change looks different if you look at the sort of just the survivors and track their language and stuff?
Of course, it's a huge issue because when you deal with that final point on the x-axis, that's 8 people.
Right.
And I wish I had a more complicated metric for determining what. And now I had to learn programming for this thing, and now if I could do it again, I would have made it more complicated. I'd exploit 3 or 4 different metadata features and say they need to post a certain amount of times within a certain time frame, and then have a certain number of replies, and I would maybe build a more complicated metric for different groups, and I think maybe that would capture that distinction a little bit. This one was kind of, this is quite brutal the way I did this, but if I had my time over.
You got me worried your earlier comment about full stops online and being so fluent in interpreting them, because I like using full stops. I always say, no, obviously I've been defending people.
Oh, no.
Who's the community that picks up on those?
Well, I think it's probably something to more digital natives who have been using instant messenger and things quite a lot. People are also very aware of when they're speaking to other people who speak a different. I mean, if you meet someone whose English isn't so good, you often accommodate them by speaking in a different way. I write totally different emails to certain colleagues based on whether they're another PhD student, whether they're a supervisor or something like that. And so I think people are so attuned to that sort of minutia that so when you're dealing with somebody who doesn't use those conventions, you quickly say, oh, that wasn't an angry full stop, that was just a normal one.
I don't even leave with a full stop key off my keyboard.
Just switch it to semicolons or something and really make it post-structural. Yeah, I think that's about all I've got, guys. But the other things I want to stress is anybody can download the tools and run them, and it's super fun. I don't know whether we have any Python developers or anything in the room, but that would be fun. And I would really appreciate some continued correspondence with. It's so disappointing to go so far through a candidature and then not realize that so many people are working on similar projects just in different buildings, and so you never meet them. And I think Subu is fairly central, so maybe I can circulate an opportunity for people to come and sit at Subu and just talk about language and computers and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a shame that I haven't met any of you before this.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Please join me.
Sorry about all the grammar. It's really rough.
You need to apologise for us now. I want to learn about. Actually, I can't remember the name of it. Systemic functional
Functional linguistics.